Zethkalar's story begins 47 years ago, when he was a young fleet coordinator aboard the hegemony dreadnought Eternal Dominance. The ship stretched nearly 12 kilometers from bow to stern, bristling with plasma cannons and graviton disruptors that could crack a planet's crust. It was one of 400 vessels in the Conquest Armada, the largest military force ever assembled by the Altarian hegemony. "We were magnificent," Zethkalar says, his voice carrying a bitter edge of lost pride. "Our ships gleamed like jewels against the void, our formations precise as clockwork. Admiral HFY himself led the fleet, the hero of 17 successful annexations. We had never known defeat. The target was a small star system on the outer rim of the galaxy, recently discovered by long-range scouts. The third planet showed signs of primitive civilization, scattered cities, basic satellite networks, chemical propulsion rockets that barely reached their own moon. According to hegemony intelligence, the inhabitants called themselves humans and had only recently developed nuclear weapons. It should have been routine," Zethkalar continues, his crystalline eyes reflecting the dim lighting of the interview room. "Standard protocol: arrive in overwhelming force, demonstrate superior firepower, accept surrender, establish hegemony rule. Most species capitulate within hours once they see our fleet, the smart ones anyway." The Conquest Armada dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system on March 15, 2384, Earth's calendar. 400 massive warships, their hulls gleaming with the dark metal that had conquered dozens of worlds. They maintained perfect formation as they advanced toward the small blue world, broadcasting standard surrender demands in 17 different languages. The response from Earth came 12 hours later, a single transmission from something called the United Nations Security Council. The message was brief: get out. Admiral HFY found this amusing. Standing on the bridge of the Eternal Dominance, surrounded by his senior staff, he actually laughed, a sound like grinding crystal that echoed through the command chamber. "Such spirit from such primitives," he had said. "They will make excellent laborers once properly broken." But Zethkalar noticed something the Admiral missed. As communications officer, he was monitoring all frequencies, watching the electromagnetic spectrum come alive across the human system. The primitive satellites were suddenly buzzing with encrypted traffic. The space-based telescopes were all turning toward the fleet. Most concerning of all, energy signatures were spiking across the planet's surface. Not the chaotic spikes of panic, but the organized, purposeful signatures of military mobilization. "I reported it to the Admiral," Zethkalar says, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I told him something was wrong." The humans weren't acting like any species we'd encountered before. They weren't running around in panic or trying to hide. They were preparing. Admiral HFY dismissed the concerns. After all, what could a species that had barely achieved nuclear flight possibly do against the might of the hegemony? Their most powerful weapons were fusion bombs, impressive for primitives certainly, but nothing compared to antimatter warheads and graviton weapons. Their fastest ships crawled along at a fraction of light speed while hegemony vessels could fold space itself. The Admiral ordered a demonstration of power. 3 destroyers broke from the main formation and approached Earth's moon. Their mission was simple: use mining lasers to carve the hegemony symbol into the lunar surface, visible from Earth with primitive telescopes. It was a standard intimidation tactic that had worked on 43 previous conquests. The destroyers Shard of Glory, Infinite Reach, and Stellar Hammer moved into position around Luna. Each vessel was still a massive warship by human standards, 800 meters long, bristling with weapons that could sterilize a continent. They powered up their industrial-grade laser arrays and began etching the hegemony's triple spiral symbol into the grey dust of the moon's surface. What happened next changed everything. The first sign of trouble came from long-range sensors. 3 objects had launched from Earth's surface, moving at velocities that shouldn't have been possible for human technology. They were small, barely 50 meters long, but they were accelerating at rates that would have turned any biological crew into paste. "Unmanned interceptors," HFY had said dismissively. "Probably carrying their primitive nuclear warheads. Our shields will absorb the explosions like raindrops." But Zethkalar was watching the sensor feeds more carefully. These weren't simple ballistic missiles. They were changing course, adjusting their approach vectors, demonstrating a level of guidance technology that contradicted every intelligence report about human capabilities. Worse, they were accelerating far beyond what chemical or even fusion rockets should have been able to achieve. The 3 human interceptors reached the moon in 18 minutes, a journey that should have taken them days with their reported technology. They split up, each targeting one of the hegemony destroyers with precision that spoke of advanced tactical programming. Captain Velta of the Shard of Glory had time to send one message before the first interceptor struck. Unknown propulsion system detected. Energy signature unlike anything in our databases. Attempting EVA, the transmission cut to static. The explosion wasn't nuclear, as expected. It wasn't antimatter either. The interceptor had somehow converted itself into pure energy at the moment of impact, releasing more destructive force than should have been possible from such a small mass. The Shard of Glory simply vanished, reduced to its component atoms in an instant. The crews of the other two destroyers had perhaps 30 seconds to process what they'd witnessed before their own interceptors arrived. Captain Nextel of the Infinite Reach managed to raise partial shields, but the human weapon punched through them as if they weren't there. Captain Yulgrek of the Stellar Hammer attempted to retreat, his ship's engines screaming at maximum power, but the interceptor adjusted course to match, striking with mathematical precision. 3 hegemony destroyers. Gone. Just like that. The main fleet watched in stunned silence as the debris clouds expanded around Luna. Each destroyer had carried a crew of 800. In less than 5 minutes, 2,400 hegemony personnel had been vaporized by weapons that supposedly didn't exist. The Admiral was furious. Zeth Kalar recalls, his mandibles clicking with remembered tension. Not afraid, not yet, just angry that primitives had dared to fight back. He ordered an immediate retaliation strike. Full bombardment of the largest human population centers. He wanted to make an example that would break their resistance immediately. But as the fleet powered up their bombardment systems, something else appeared on the sensors. Ships. Hundreds of them. Rising from Earth's surface and emerging from concealment positions throughout the solar system. They had been there all along, waiting, hidden behind stealth technology that made them invisible to hegemony sensors until they chose to reveal themselves. These weren't the primitive chemical rockets intelligence had reported. These were sleek, advanced warships that moved with predatory grace through the void. They bore no resemblance to the crude satellites and space stations the hegemony had observed during their reconnaissance. Admiral Krexfor stared at the tactical display as red contacts multiplied across the screen. Each human ship was smaller than his destroyers, but they moved with an agility that defied conventional physics. They accelerated without visible engines, turned without thrusters, and somehow managed to mask their energy signatures until the moment they wanted to be seen. How many? He had demanded. Contacts still appearing, sir, his sensor operator replied, voice tight with disbelief. Current count, 800 and climbing. 800 human warships emerging from nowhere like ghosts materializing in the void. They arranged themselves in a formation that was both beautiful and terrifying. A perfect sphere surrounding the hegemony fleet with mathematical precision. Every angle covered, every escape route blocked. Then came the second transmission from Earth. This time, it wasn't from their governing body. It came from something called Human Fleet Command, and the voice that spoke was calm, professional, and utterly without fear. Hegemony forces, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of Earth Defense Fleet. You came to our system with weapons of war. You destroyed property belonging to the human race. You have threatened genocide against our species. This constitutes an act of war under the laws of civilized species. You have one opportunity to withdraw immediately, or we will demonstrate why attacking humanity was the last mistake your empire will ever make. Admiral Krexvor's response was predictable. He had not become the hegemony's most successful conquest admiral by backing down from primitives, no matter how many ships they had managed to scrape together. He ordered the fleet to open fire. What followed, Zeth Kala says, was not a battle, it was a revelation. A glimpse into the true nature of the species the galaxy had dismissed as harmless primitives. The human ships didn't just fight back. They danced. They moved through the hegemony formations like phantoms, their impossible maneuverability allowing them to dodge plasma bolts and graviton beams with contemptuous ease.
Their return fire was precise, surgical, targeting specific systems with the kind of accuracy that suggested they understood hegemony's ship design better than the hegemony did.
Within minutes it became clear that every intelligence report, every assumption, every casual dismissal of human capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. The primitive species they had come to conquer had been preparing for this moment. They had watched the galaxy from their small blue world, studied every conflict, analyzed every weapon system, and designed their defenses accordingly. The humans hadn't just built warships. They had built warships specifically designed to kill hegemony vessels. But even more disturbing than their technology was their tactics. Hegemony military doctrine was based on overwhelming force and shock tactics, the same approach that had worked on dozens of worlds. The humans fought differently. They were patient, methodical, surgical in their precision. They seemed to anticipate every hegemony move, countering strategies before they were fully implemented. It was as if they had been studying hegemony tactics for decades, preparing for this exact scenario. We were like insects in a web, Zeth Kalar whispers, his four arms wrapped around himself as if seeking comfort from the memory. Every move we made only entangled us further. Every formation we tried, they had a counter for. Every weapon we fired, they had already adapted to defend against. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, 374 hegemony warships had been destroyed or crippled. The pride of the Altarian fleet, vessels that had terrorized a dozen star systems, were reduced to floating wreckage and radiation. The humans had lost 11 ships. Admiral Krexfor had died when the Eternal Dominance suffered a cascade failure in its main power core, a failure caused by a human weapon that had somehow inverted the ship's own graviton field, turning its defensive systems into instruments of self-destruction. His last words, recorded by the ship's emergency beacon, were a question, how? As the surviving hegemony ships attempted to retreat, Admiral Chen's voice filled the void once more. But this time, the calm professionalism was gone, replaced by something that made Zeth Kalar's species equivalent of blood run cold. Hegemony survivors, she said, you will return to your empire with this message. Humanity is not a conquest to be claimed. We are not a species to be enslaved. We are not primitives to be dismissed. We are your worst nightmare made manifest, a species that has spent its entire evolutionary history perfecting the art of warfare. Every conflict we have fought, every weapon we have forged, every tactical innovation we have developed has prepared us for this moment. The transmission paused, and in that silence, Zeth Kalar could hear his own pulse thundering in his ears. Tell your empire this. We did not seek this war, but we will finish it. You came to our home expecting to find victims. Instead, you found predators. And now, those predators know where you live. The retreat from Sol was a nightmare that would haunt Zeth Kalar for the rest of his life. The 26 surviving hegemony ships limped away from Earth's solar system, their crews traumatized and their commanders struggling to comprehend what had just occurred. The humans had let them go, a decision that seemed merciful at the time, but would later reveal itself as part of a far more terrifying strategy. We thought we were fortunate, Zeth Kalar says, his voice heavy with bitter irony. Admiral Chen could have destroyed us all. She had us completely at her mercy. The fact that she allowed survivors seemed like an act of primitive compassion. We couldn't have been more wrong. The journey back to hegemony space took 12 standard rotations through hyperspace. During that time, the surviving crews tried to make sense of what they had witnessed. How had the humans hidden such an advanced fleet? How had their intelligence been so catastrophically wrong? Where had the primitive species acquired technology that surpassed hegemony science? Commander Velnash of the damaged cruiser Crimson Spear proposed the theory that became accepted wisdom among the survivors. The humans had encountered another spacefaring species years earlier and had somehow acquired alien technology. It was the only explanation that made sense. No species could develop such advanced capabilities in isolation, especially not one that had been observed to be struggling with basic spaceflight only decades earlier. But Zeth Kalar had studied the battle recordings obsessively during the long journey home, and he had noticed something the others missed. The human weapons weren't alien designs adapted for their use. They were distinctly human in their concept and execution. The energy-to-mass conversion weapons that had destroyed the destroyers were based on theoretical physics that humans themselves had pioneered. The impossibly maneuverable ships used a propulsion system that appeared to be a practical application of human theoretical work in gravitational manipulation. The humans hadn't stolen alien technology. They had developed it themselves, and they had done so specifically to fight hegemony forces. They knew we were coming, Zeth Kalar realizes now, though it took him years to accept the truth. Not just that someone might come eventually, they knew the hegemony specifically was coming. They had been preparing for us for decades, maybe longer. The evidence was there in the battle recordings for anyone willing to see it. Human weapons were designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in hegemony shield technology. Their ship configurations were optimized to counter standard hegemony formations. Their tactics seemed drawn from a detailed study of hegemony military doctrine. Most disturbing of all, they had known exactly how many ships the Conquest Armada would bring. The sphere formation that had trapped the hegemony fleet was precisely calibrated for 400 enemy vessels. If the fleet had been larger or smaller, the formation wouldn't have worked as effectively. The humans had been watching, learning, planning. When the survivors finally reached Altarian Prime, the hegemony's capital world, they found an empire in chaos. News of the disaster had somehow preceded them, though that should have been impossible given the speed of their retreat. Emergency sessions of the High Command were already in progress, and the entire military was mobilizing for what many assumed would be a massive retaliatory campaign. Zeth Kalar and the other survivors were immediately taken into custody, not as prisoners, but as crucial witnesses. They were separated and subjected to intensive debriefing sessions that lasted for days. Every detail of the battle was analyzed, every moment of human behavior scrutinized, every weapon signature catalogued. Supreme Admiral Kexthal, the hegemony's highest military authority, personally interviewed each survivor. When Zeth Kalar's turn came, he found himself face to face with the most decorated warrior in Altarian history, a being who had personally led the conquest of 8 star systems and had never known defeat. "Tell me about their leader," Kexthal demanded. "This Admiral Chen. What manner of creature issues threats against the hegemony itself?" Zeth Kalar closed his crystalline eyes, remembering the voice that had spoken with such calm authority, even as human weapons tore through the pride of the hegemony fleet. She spoke as if she had already won, Supreme Admiral. Not hopeful, not desperate, not even particularly angry. She spoke with certainty, as if the outcome had been predetermined. "And their ships. Their weapons? Beyond our current understanding, sir, but not beyond their understanding. They wielded this technology with the confidence of masters, not the uncertainty of beings using stolen or improvised equipment." Supreme Admiral Kexthal was silent for a long moment, studying the reports spread across his desk. Finally, he looked up at Zeth Kalar with an expression that the communications officer had never seen on a superior's face before: uncertainty.
You believe they will come for us?
"I believe," Zeth Kalar said carefully, "that Admiral Chen's final transmission was not a threat, sir. It was a statement of fact." The Supreme Admiral dismissed him, but Zeth Kalar could see that his words had found their mark. The unthinkable was being considered at the highest levels of hegemony leadership, the possibility that the primitives they had tried to conquer might actually be capable of threatening the hegemony itself. Those concerns proved to be well-founded. The first attack came 3 rotations later, striking the outer system of Veltar, the same system that had been the launching point for the Conquest Armada. The hegemony maintained a significant naval base there, with a garrison of 50 warships and extensive orbital installations. The attack lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it was over, the naval base was gone. Not damaged, not crippled, gone. Reduced to expanding clouds of superheated gas and metal fragments. The 50 warships of the garrison had been systematically dismantled by weapons that seemed to understand their vulnerabilities better than their own designers did. The humans had left behind a single automated beacon, broadcasting a simple message in perfect Altarian: "This is the price of aggression. There will be more." But it was how the attack had been carried out that truly terrified Hegemony Command. The human fleet had appeared without warning, struck with surgical precision, and vanished before any reinforcements could arrive. They had somehow traveled deep into hegemony territory without being detected by any of the sensor networks that monitored the Empire's borders. More disturbing still was the intelligence the attack demonstrated. The human forces had known exactly which installations to target, which ships would respond first, which defensive systems would activate in what order. They had struck with the kind of tactical knowledge that should have taken years of reconnaissance to acquire. Supreme Admiral Kexthal immediately ordered increased patrols along the hegemony's borders and implemented new security protocols for all military installations. Additional fleets were recalled from conquest duties and redeployed for defensive operations. The Empire's vast intelligence network was activated to locate and monitor human movements throughout the galaxy. None of it mattered. The second attack came 6 rotations later, hitting the industrial world of Nexville. This time, the humans targeted the planet's manufacturing centers. Specifically, the facilities that produce components for hegemony warships. The orbital bombardment was precise beyond belief, destroying only military-related infrastructure while leaving civilian areas untouched. But the psychological impact was devastating. Nexville was deep inside hegemony territory, protected by 3 separate defensive fleets and surrounded by early warning sensor networks. The fact that humans had penetrated so far into the Empire's heartland without detection sent shockwaves through the military hierarchy. Zeth Kalar, now assigned to intelligence analysis at Hegemony Strategic Command, studied the attack patterns obsessively. The humans weren't just conducting random raids, they were implementing a systematic campaign designed to cripple the hegemony's ability to wage war while minimizing civilian casualties. "They're not trying to conquer us," he reported to his superior, Commander Rextol. "They're trying to dismantle our military capacity while preserving the civilian population. It's a precision surgical operation on an interstellar scale, Commander Rexdal dismissed this analysis as speculation, but Zethkalar's theory was proven correct when the third attack came. The humans struck the hegemony's primary military academy on Kextara, the prestigious institution that trained the Empire's officer corps. The attack came during the night cycle when most cadets would be in their dormitories. Instead of orbital bombardment, the humans deployed ground forces. The security recordings from that night would become classified material of the highest order, but Zethkalar saw them during his intelligence duties. What he witnessed changed his understanding of humanity forever. Human soldiers moved through the academy like shadows, disabling security systems, neutralizing guards, and capturing cadets with efficiency that spoke of exhaustive preparation. They knew the layout of every building, the location of every security checkpoint, the timing of every patrol. They moved as if they had trained for this specific mission for months. But it wasn't their tactical precision that horrified Zethkalar. It was their restraint. Despite carrying weapons that could have leveled the academy, the humans used only non-lethal force. Cadets were stunned unconscious rather than killed. Guards were incapacitated rather than executed. Even when faced with armed resistance, the human soldiers showed a level of fire discipline that was almost incomprehensible. In 6 hours, they had captured nearly 3,000 Altarian cadets, the future leadership of the hegemony military, without a single fatality. Then they disappeared as completely as they had arrived, taking their prisoners with them. The message they left behind was longer this time, delivered in a recording by Admiral Chen herself. Her image appeared on every communication screen in the academy, and her words were broadcast throughout hegemony space. "People of the Altarian hegemony," she began, her voice carrying the same calm authority Zethkalar remembered from Sol. "Your leaders chose war. They came to our world with weapons intended for genocide. They sought to enslave our species and claim our planet as their own. This aggression cannot stand unanswered." She paused, and the camera angle shifted to show rows of Altarian cadets in what appeared to be clean, comfortable detention facilities. They looked unharmed but subdued, the reality of their situation clearly weighing on their young minds. "These young beings are not our enemies," Admiral Chen continued. "They are victims of their leaders' ambitions, just as our children would have been victims if your conquest had succeeded. They will be treated with the dignity and respect that prisoners of war deserve, under civilized law. They will be returned unharmed when your government agrees to end its campaign of interstellar aggression." The transmission shifted again, this time showing what appeared to be detailed schematics of hegemony military installations throughout the Empire. Base layouts, defensive systems, personnel assignments, information that should have been impossible for humans to obtain. "But understand this," Admiral Chen's voice continued over the scrolling images. "We know everything. Every base, every ship, every installation you consider secret. We have been watching your empire for longer than you realize, studying your methods, preparing for your inevitable expansion into our space. You are not fighting a primitive species that stumbled into advanced technology. You are fighting a species that has spent centuries perfecting the art of warfare, and we have been preparing specifically to fight you." The schematics disappeared, replaced once again by Admiral Chen's face. This time, her expression was harder, more focused. "Your Supreme Admiral believes this conflict can be won through superior numbers and traditional tactics. He is wrong. Your intelligence services believe our capabilities are limited to what they have observed. They are wrong. Your political leaders believe that negotiation from a position of strength will force us to submit. They are catastrophically wrong." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes seeming to look directly at whoever might be watching. "We are not the primitives you came to conquer. We are the species that conquered this galaxy's greatest predators, our own kind. Every advance in our technology, every innovation in our tactics, every evolution in our strategic thinking has been driven by the need to overcome opponents who shared our intelligence, our determination, and our capacity for violence. You represent a significant threat, but you are not the most dangerous enemy we have ever faced." The transmission ended with coordinates, the location where Altarian negotiators could come to discuss the return of the cadets and, potentially, an end to hostilities. Supreme Admiral Kexthal's response was to mobilize the entire hegemony fleet for a massive offensive against human space. Over 8,000 warships were assembled from across the Empire, representing the largest military force in Altarian history. The plan was simple: overwhelm the humans through sheer numbers, retake the Sol system, and end the threat once and for all. Zethkalar watched the preparations with growing dread. He had studied every piece of intelligence about human capabilities, had analyzed every moment of their previous encounters, and had reached a conclusion that no one wanted to hear. The humans were not just technologically superior, they were strategically superior as well. They want us to gather our fleets, he warned Commander Rextol during one of their briefings. Every action they've taken has been calculated to provoke exactly this response. They're herding us toward a confrontation of their choosing. Impossible, Rextol replied. No species could manipulate hegemony strategic thinking to that degree. But Zethkalar was beginning to understand that the humans had been manipulating hegemony strategic thinking from the very beginning. The initial intelligence reports that had described them as primitives. How had those reports been compiled? Through long-range observation and intercepted communications. Communications that the humans would have known were being intercepted. Observations that the humans could have controlled by hiding their true capabilities. The entire Conquest Armada mission had been based on information the humans had essentially provided themselves. As the massive hegemony fleet prepared to depart for Sol, Zethkala requested a transfer to a different assignment. He couldn't bear the thought of witnessing another catastrophe, especially one on the scale that 8,000 warships would represent. His request was denied. As one of the few survivors of the original contact, his experience was considered too valuable to waste on rear echelon duties. So Zethkalar found himself once again aboard a hegemony warship heading toward human space, once again serving as communications officer on a mission that he was certain would end in disaster. This time he was aboard the Super Dreadnought Final Authority, flagship of Supreme Admiral Kexthal himself. The massive vessel was over 20 kilometers long and carried enough firepower to sterilize a planet. It was accompanied by 7,990 other warships, representing every major species in the hegemony, and carrying a combined crew of over 12 million beings. As they approached the edge of Sol system, Zethkalar monitored the communication frequencies with growing anxiety. The electromagnetic spectrum around Earth was quiet. Too quiet. No military chatter, no defensive preparations, no signs of the massive fleet that had destroyed the Conquest Armada. Where are they? Supreme Admiral Kexthal demanded, staring at the tactical display that showed empty space where human ships should be waiting. Zethkalar checked his instruments again, but the readings remained the same. Whatever the humans were planning, they were keeping their cards hidden until the final moment. The hegemony fleet advanced toward Earth in perfect formation, weapons powered up, and shields at maximum strength. This time, there would be no surprises, no tactical innovations that could overcome sheer numerical superiority. That's when the stars went out. The first sign something was wrong came from the navigation systems. Ships throughout the hegemony fleet began reporting discrepancies in their stellar positioning data. Stars that should have been visible from their current location were simply gone from the sensors, while other stellar objects appeared in positions that contradicted all established star charts. Zethkalar stared at his communication console in growing alarm as reports flooded in from across the massive fleet. It wasn't just a few ships experiencing technical difficulties. It was every vessel, every sensor array, every navigation computer, simultaneously reporting the same impossible readings. "Sir," reported the navigation officer aboard the Final Authority, his voice tight with confusion. "I'm reading stellar positions that don't match any known configuration." It's as if we've been transported to an entirely different section of the galaxy. Supreme Admiral Kexthal examined the stellar cartography display with increasing frustration. The familiar constellations that had guided hegemony navigation for centuries were nowhere to be found. In their place was a star field that seemed almost random, lacking the ordered patterns that marked the civilized regions of space. "Sensor malfunction," the Admiral declared firmly. 8,000 ships don't just get lost simultaneously. Run full diagnostics on all navigation systems. But Zethkalar was monitoring the fleet communication networks, and what he heard chilled him to his core. Ship after ship was confirming the same readings. The most advanced navigation computers in the hegemony, devices that could plot courses across thousands of light years with mathematical precision, were all reporting identical impossible data. "Admiral," Zethkalar said carefully, "I'm receiving confirmation from multiple ships. This doesn't appear to be a technical malfunction." Before Kexthal could respond, the long-range sensors detected something that made every officer on the bridge freeze in shock. Ships. Thousands of them, arranged in perfect formations throughout the star system they now found themselves in. But these weren't human vessels. They were hegemony ships, identical to the ones in their own fleet. "Impossible," breathed the tactical officer. "Those are our ships. I'm reading the signature codes of vessels that are right here in our formation." Supreme Admiral Kexthal stared at the display, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. The sensors showed the Final Authority itself, clearly visible among the enemy formation, along with dozens of other ships that were simultaneously present in their own fleet. That's when Admiral Chen's voice filled the void, broadcast on all frequencies with crystal clarity. "Welcome to the labyrinth, Supreme Admiral Kexthal." The view screen shimmered and resolved to show Admiral Chen standing on what appeared to be the bridge of a human warship. But behind her, visible through massive transparent aluminum windows, was a sight that defied comprehension. A star field that seemed to shift and rotate, with stellar objects moving in patterns that violated every known law of physics. "You are currently experiencing humanity's most advanced strategic weapon," she continued, her voice maintaining that same calm professionalism that had become her trademark. "We call it the Labyrinth, a pocket dimension created through controlled manipulation of space-time itself. The starfield you are observing is artificial, generated by gravitational projectors placed at strategic points throughout this dimensional bubble." Supreme Admiral Kexthal found his voice, though it carried a tremor that his officers had never heard before. "This is impossible. No species has mastered dimensional manipulation to this degree." Admiral Chen smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both pleasant and terrifying. "No species but humanity, Admiral. You see, when you spend your entire evolutionary history fighting yourselves, you develop some very creative solutions to tactical problems. The labyrinth was originally designed to contain our own worst impulses, to provide a controlled environment where human conflicts could be resolved without threatening civilian populations." The view screen shifted to show a three-dimensional representation of the space they now occupied. It was vast, easily large enough to contain solar systems, but finite, bounded by barriers that glowed with strange energy signatures. "The dimension you now occupy is completely isolated from normal space-time," Admiral Chen explained. "No communications can enter or leave, no ships can escape without our permission, no reinforcements can arrive to assist you. You are, quite literally, in a world of our making, subject to rules of our design." Zeth Kalar watched the Admiral's reaction with fascination and horror. Kexthal was one of the most experienced military commanders in hegemony history, a being who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious through superior tactics and unshakable will. But now he looked like a lost child, overwhelmed by concepts that challenged his fundamental understanding of reality. "What do you want?" Kexthal managed to ask. "What I have always wanted, Admiral. An end to hegemony aggression. You came to our space with 8,000 warships, intending to overwhelm us through superior numbers. We have removed those numbers from the equation. Here, in the labyrinth, your fleet is just another variable in a tactical problem we designed." The display changed again, showing what appeared to be historical footage of human conflicts. Zeth Kalar recognized some of the imagery from intelligence briefings. Primitive human armies clashing with crude weapons, their cities burning under conventional bombardment. "You made a fundamental error in your assessment of our species," Admiral Chen continued as the images played. "You assumed that our conflicts with each other indicated primitive strategic thinking.
In reality, those conflicts represent the most sophisticated military education any species has ever received."
Every human war has been a laboratory for innovation, every battle a classroom for tactical evolution. The footage shifted to show more recent human military operations, not the crude chemical explosives and ballistic weapons the hegemony expected, but coordinated campaigns that demonstrated strategic thinking on a level that few galactic civilizations had achieved. While other species were learning to fight aliens with different biologies, different technologies, different methods of thinking, humanity was learning to fight itself. We were forced to overcome opponents who shared our intelligence, our creativity, our determination to survive. Every advantage we developed, our enemies could copy. Every weakness we displayed, our opponents would exploit. Zeth Kalar found himself nodding unconsciously. The implications were staggering. Most spacefaring species had evolved as the dominant intelligence on their homeworlds, with little to no serious competition. Their military development had been focused on relatively simple problems, overwhelming technologically inferior opponents or establishing dominance over species with fundamentally different cognitive processes. Humanity had evolved in a completely different environment. They had been forced to develop military systems capable of defeating opponents who were identical to themselves in every way except training and equipment. The result was a species that approached warfare with a level of sophistication that other civilizations couldn't match. The labyrinth, Admiral Chen continued, is just one example of what humans can accomplish when we focus our complete attention on a military problem. We have had 200 years to prepare for contact with aggressive alien civilizations, 200 years to study your methods, analyze your weaknesses, and develop appropriate countermeasures. Supreme Admiral Kexthal was studying the tactical display with growing desperation. Even if everything Admiral Chen said was true, he still commanded 8,000 warships crewed by experienced warriors. The humans might have technological advantages, but they were still vastly outnumbered. "You cannot defeat this fleet," he declared with more confidence than he felt. "Even in your artificial dimension, you lack the numbers to engage us effectively. We will overwhelm your defenses through sheer weight of firepower." Admiral Chen's smile widened. "Admiral, you're still thinking in conventional terms. You assume this will be a traditional battle where numbers provide an advantage. Allow me to introduce you to the real nature of the labyrinth." The starfield around them began to shift. What had appeared to be distant stellar objects suddenly revealed themselves to be something else entirely. Massive geometric structures that move with purpose and intelligence through the artificial space. They weren't ships in any conventional sense, but they were clearly technological constructs of immense size and power. "These are mirrors, Admiral. Each one is capable of creating perfect duplicates of any ship or fleet that enters the labyrinth. They don't just copy the physical structure. They replicate the crews, the memories, the tactical knowledge, everything that makes a warship effective." As if to demonstrate, one of the mirror structures pulsed with energy, and suddenly the sensor displays lit up with new contacts. Perfect copies of hegemony warships began appearing throughout the artificial star system, identical down to the smallest detail to the vessels in Kextal's fleet. But these weren't empty hulks. They were fully operational warships crewed by perfect duplicates of the original crews, complete with all their knowledge and experience. Within minutes, the hegemony fleet found itself facing an identical force with equal numbers, equal training, and equal determination. "The strategic applications are endless," Admiral Chen explained as chaos erupted throughout the hegemony communication networks. Ship commanders were reporting contact with identical vessels, receiving hails from perfect copies of themselves, attempting to engage enemies who knew their tactics as well as they did. "Your fleet knows how to fight aliens with different technologies and different strategies. But how well do you fight yourselves? How do you overcome an enemy who shares all your strengths but none of your weaknesses? How do you defeat an opponent who knows every tactic you might use because they are you?" Zeth Kalar watched in fascination as the two identical fleets maneuvered for advantage. It was like watching a cosmic chess match, where both players had access to identical pieces and identical strategies. Every move was countered by an equal and opposite response. Every formation was met by a perfect counter-formation. But slowly, subtly, the duplicate fleet began to gain advantages. They moved with slightly better coordination, reacted to threats with marginally superior timing, executed complex maneuvers with incrementally greater precision. "The duplicates learn," Admiral Chen noted with scientific interest. "They start as perfect copies, but they improve with each engagement. They retain the memories and skills of the originals while being enhanced by human tactical programming. They become better versions of your own crews." Supreme Admiral Kextal was experiencing something no hegemony commander had ever faced. A completely fair fight against an opponent of exactly equal strength. But it was becoming clear that equal strength wouldn't be enough. The duplicate fleet was gradually establishing superiority through marginal advantages that compounded over time. "This is impossible," Kextal breathed, watching as his perfect duplicate began to outmaneuver him. "No species could develop this level of technology. No species but humanity," Admiral Chen corrected, "because no species but humanity has ever needed to. You've spent your military history fighting opponents who are fundamentally different from yourselves. We spent ours fighting opponents who are fundamentally identical to ourselves. The result is that we became very, very good at creating advantages where none should exist." The battle raged for hours, with 8,000 hegemony ships engaging 8,000 perfect copies of themselves. But gradually, inevitably, the duplicates gained the upper hand. They fought with all the skill and determination of the originals, enhanced by tactical algorithms that had been refined through centuries of human military innovation. One by one, hegemony ships began to fall. Not through overwhelming force or superior technology, but through tiny tactical advantages that accumulated into decisive victories. A marginally better approach angle here, a slightly more efficient power distribution there, a fractionally superior timing on weapons deployment. The kinds of advantages that only became apparent when two identical forces engaged. "Your crews are brave and skilled," Admiral Chen acknowledged as the final authority found itself under fire from its own duplicate, fighting an enemy that knew its capabilities perfectly because it shared them. But they were trained to fight aliens. They were never prepared to fight themselves. Zethkala found himself in the bizarre position of coordinating communications with a perfect duplicate of himself, who was attempting to kill him. The other Zethkala had all his memories, all his training, all his personal quirks and preferences. It was like fighting a mirror that had somehow become hostile. "Admiral," he reported to Kextul, "I'm receiving tactical updates from ships throughout the fleet. The duplicates aren't just copies, they're improved copies. They know everything we know, but they also know things we don't. Such as?
They know our weaknesses better than we do.
They're exploiting vulnerabilities in our ships and tactics that we weren't even aware existed." The battle was reaching its climax. Nearly half the hegemony fleet had been destroyed or disabled, while the duplicate fleet had lost fewer than a quarter of its numbers. The mathematics of the engagement were inexorable. The originals were fighting a losing battle against superior versions of themselves. Supreme Admiral Kextul made the decision that no hegemony commander had ever been forced to make in over 2 centuries of conquest. He ordered a general retreat, but retreat proved impossible. The labyrinth had no exits except those controlled by human forces. The artificial dimension was a perfect trap, designed specifically to contain hostile fleets until they could be neutralized. "You have a choice, Admiral," Chen's voice announced as the final authority took heavy damage from its duplicate. "Surrender now, and your crews will be treated as prisoners of war under civilized law. Continue fighting, and we will allow the duplicates to demonstrate the full extent of their tactical superiority." Kextel looked around his bridge at officers who had never known defeat, warriors who had conquered star systems with their tactical brilliance. Now they faced enemies who shared that brilliance while surpassing it in every measurable way. "What assurance do we have that you will honor prisoner of war protocols?" he asked. "You have my word as a human being," Admiral Chen replied simply, "and you have the evidence of how we treated the cadets we captured from your military academy. We are not a species that finds satisfaction in unnecessary cruelty." The Supreme Admiral studied the tactical display one final time. His fleet was broken, outmaneuvered by perfect copies of itself. His ships were trapped in an artificial dimension with no hope of escape or reinforcement. His crews faced enemies who knew them better than they knew themselves. For the first time in his military career, Kextul gave the order to surrender. The duplicate fleet immediately ceased fire, holding position but maintaining weapons lock on every surviving hegemony vessel. Admiral Chen's image appeared on every view screen throughout the defeated fleet. "Hegemony forces, you are now prisoners of war. You will be treated with dignity and respect, provided with adequate food and medical care, and given the opportunity to communicate with your families once appropriate security measures have been implemented." She paused, looking directly at Supreme Admiral Kextul. "Admiral, you have experienced today what every human military commander learns early in their training. The most dangerous enemy you will ever face is yourself. The hegemony has spent centuries fighting aliens who think differently, react differently, and organize differently than you do. Today you fought opponents who shared your strengths while exceeding your capabilities." The view screen shifted to show images of hegemony colonies throughout the Empire, not military installations, but civilian populations going about their daily lives in apparent peace and security. "The war between our species ends now," Admiral Chen declared. "But understand that it ends on humanity's terms. The hegemony's age of conquest is over. Your empire will begin a transition to a more peaceful form of government, one that seeks cooperation rather than domination." Supreme Admiral Kextul found his voice one last time. "And if we refuse?" Admiral Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "Then you will discover what happens when humanity stops holding back." The transition began immediately after the surrender in the labyrinth. Zef Kalar and his fellow prisoners found themselves aboard human transport vessels that were nothing like the brutal prisoner ships used by the hegemony's own forces. The accommodations were clean, comfortable, and designed with obvious consideration for Altarian physiology. The human guards were professional but not hostile, treating their charges with a level of respect that bordered on incomprehensible. "I don't understand," Zethakala confided to his cellmate, former Captain Nexthara of the destroyer Void's Edge. "They defeated us completely, humiliated our entire military philosophy, and now they treat us like honored guests. What kind of species shows such restraint after achieving total victory?" Captain Nexthara, a veteran of 12 conquest campaigns, shared his confusion. "Perhaps they're softening us for interrogation? Or maybe they plan to use us as propaganda tools against our own people?" But as days passed, it became clear that the humans' treatment of their prisoners was genuine. They provided medical care for the wounded, allowed communication with families back home, and even arranged for educational programs for younger crew members who wanted to continue their studies. The food was nutritionally appropriate for Altarian biology, the quarters were spacious enough to accommodate their four-armed physiology, and the recreational facilities included games and entertainment systems adapted from hegemony designs. Most remarkably, the humans made no attempt to extract military secrets through coercion. Instead, they offered voluntary debriefing sessions where hegemony officers could discuss their experiences and observations. The humans seemed more interested in understanding hegemony culture and philosophy than in exploiting tactical intelligence. Zethkalar attended several of these sessions, drawn by curiosity about his captor's motivations. The human officers who conducted the interviews displayed a level of cultural sensitivity that seemed almost impossible given the recent hostilities. They asked thoughtful questions about Altarian society, expressed genuine interest in hegemony history, and avoided topics that might be considered sensitive military information. During one particularly memorable session, Zethkalar found himself in conversation with Colonel Sara Martinez, a human xenosociologist who spoke fluent Altarian with only a slight accent. "We've been studying your species for over 50 years, she explained when he commented on her linguistic abilities. "Not just your military capabilities, but your culture, your art, your philosophy. We wanted to understand who you were before we made contact." "You were planning this war for 50 years? Colonel Martinez shook her head. "We were planning for peace for 50 years. The war was your choice, not ours. Everything we did was designed to end hostilities as quickly as possible with minimum casualties on both sides." Zethkalar considered this carefully. The labyrinth, the duplicate fleets, the surgical strikes on military targets while avoiding civilians, all of this was intended to minimize casualties? Of course, war is wasteful and tragic under the best circumstances. We saw no reason to make it more wasteful or more tragic than absolutely necessary. This conversation haunted Zethkalar for weeks. The humans had demonstrated capabilities that could have resulted in the complete annihilation of the hegemony. Yet they had chosen restraint at every opportunity. They had captured rather than killed, disabled rather than destroyed, and shown mercy when revenge would have been understandable. Meanwhile, reports began filtering in from throughout hegemony space about the nature of humanity's occupation. The humans had indeed arrived at every major hegemony world simultaneously, their fleets appearing without warning in perfect formations around each planet. But instead of the brutal subjugation that typically followed hegemony conquests, the humans implemented what they called peaceful transition protocols. The occupation was unlike anything in galactic history. Human administrators worked alongside existing hegemony officials to maintain essential services. Human engineers provided technical assistance to improve infrastructure and living conditions. Human medical personnel offered advanced treatments for diseases that had plagued Altarian populations for generations. Most shocking of all, the humans made it clear that their presence was temporary. They weren't conquering the hegemony to establish a human empire. They were reorganizing it to eliminate its capacity for further aggression while preserving its cultural identity and social structures. Commander Velnash, who had proposed the theory about humans acquiring alien technology, was among the prisoners who volunteered for extended debriefing sessions. He returned from one such session with a look of profound disbelief. "They're not lying," he told his fellow prisoners during their recreational period. "The human technology, the tactical innovations, the strategic thinking, all of it is genuinely human in origin. They developed everything themselves, specifically to counter hegemony expansion." "But how?" demanded Captain Nextara. "No species could advance so rapidly without outside assistance." "That's what I thought," Velnash replied. "But I've seen their developmental history. They didn't advance rapidly. They advanced constantly. Every generation built upon the innovations of the previous one. Every conflict drove new technological development. Every peace provided time for scientific advancement." He pulled up a holographic display showing human population growth over the past several centuries. The curve was unlike anything seen in other galactic civilizations. Steep, consistent, and showing no signs of the periodic collapses that typically accompanied rapid technological development. "They never had a dark age," Velnash continued. "No massive wars that destroyed accumulated knowledge. No environmental catastrophes that forced them to start over. No internal conflicts that consumed their scientific resources. They had the most dangerous combination possible. Continuous progress combined with continuous pressure to improve their military capabilities." Zethkalar studied the display with growing understanding. Most species experience cycles of advancement and decline, with periodic setbacks that slowed their overall development. Humanity had somehow avoided these setbacks while maintaining the competitive pressure that drove innovation. They were fighting themselves, he realized aloud. All those internal conflicts didn't slow their development, they accelerated it. Every war forced both sides to innovate or die. Every peace allowed those innovations to spread throughout their species. The implications were staggering. While other civilizations had spent centuries recovering from major conflicts, humanity had used their conflicts as catalysts for advancement. They had turned war itself into an engine of progress, developing capabilities that no external threat could match because they had always faced the ultimate challenge: opponents who were exactly as intelligent, determined, and innovative as themselves. This understanding was reinforced when human officials began implementing their transition protocols among the prisoners themselves. Rather than simply confining the captured hegemony personnel, the humans offered educational opportunities designed to prepare them for roles in the post-war galaxy. Zeth-Kalar found himself enrolled in a program that human instructors called Comparative Strategic Analysis. The curriculum was unlike anything taught in hegemony military academies. Instead of focusing on conquest tactics and occupation strategies, it emphasized conflict resolution, diplomatic negotiation, and what humans termed win-win scenarios. The human instructor, Professor David Chen, who claimed to be a distant relative of Admiral Chen herself, presented strategic thinking as a tool for solving problems rather than defeating enemies. Traditional military education focuses on zero-sum conflicts, he explained during one lecture. One side wins, the other loses, and success is measured by the extent of the defeated enemy's losses. Human strategic thinking evolved beyond this limitation centuries ago. He displayed a series of case studies from human military history, showing conflicts that had been resolved through methods that left both sides better off than before the hostilities began. We learned that the most decisive victories are achieved when your former enemies become your allies, Professor Chen continued. Conquest creates resentment, which creates instability, which creates the need for continuous military presence to maintain control. Cooperation creates mutual benefit, which creates stability, which reduces the need for military solutions. Zeth-Kalar found these concepts difficult to grasp initially. The entire foundation of hegemony civilization was built on the assumption that resources were limited and could only be obtained by taking them from others. The idea that conflicts could be resolved in ways that benefited everyone involved seemed to contradict basic mathematics. But as the educational program continued, he began to understand the sophistication of human strategic thinking. They had learned to view conflicts not as competitions for limited resources, but as problems that could be solved through creative application of superior technology and organizational capabilities. The humans weren't just militarily superior to the hegemony, they were economically superior as well. They had developed production methods that could generate wealth at rates that made conquest unnecessary. They could create resources rather than simply taking them from others. This revelation was supported by reports from the occupied hegemony worlds. Human administrators weren't stripping planets of their resources to support human colonies. Instead, they were improving production efficiency, introducing new technologies, and actually increasing the standard of living for hegemony citizens. They're making our worlds more prosperous than they were under our own government, Captain Nexthara reported, after receiving a communication from his family on Altarian Prime. My wife says the human engineers have improved the water purification systems, upgraded the power grid, and introduced manufacturing techniques that have tripled factory output. Similar reports came from throughout hegemony space. The humans weren't exploiting their conquered territories, they were developing them. Citizens who had expected brutal occupation instead found themselves living under a government that was more efficient, more responsive, and more focused on improving their daily lives than the hegemony had ever been. But perhaps most remarkably, the humans were keeping their promise about the temporary nature of their presence. 6 months after the surrender, they began implementing what they called graduated autonomy protocols. Hegemony worlds that demonstrated stable governance and peaceful policies were given increasing degrees of self-rule. The process was carefully managed, with human advisors working alongside local officials to ensure smooth transitions. But it was genuine. Planets that had been under direct human military control were gradually returned to civilian hegemony administration, with the understanding that any return to aggressive policies would result in renewed intervention. Zeth-Kalar watched these developments with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. The humans were voluntarily giving up control over territories they had conquered at great cost and effort. No species in galactic history had ever behaved in such a manner. Why? He asked Professor Chen during a private tutorial session. You could rule the galaxy. Your technology is centuries ahead of anyone else's. Your strategic thinking is unmatched and your military capabilities are overwhelming. Why are you giving conquered territory back to the people you defeated? Professor Chen smiled, an expression Zeth Kalar had learned to associate with humans, explaining concepts they found obvious but others found incomprehensible. Because ruling the galaxy was never our objective, he replied. Our objective was to stop the hegemony from threatening humanity. Once that threat is eliminated, we have no interest in maintaining an empire. But empires provide security, resources, strategic depth. Empires also provide resentment, rebellion, and the constant need to suppress populations that would prefer self-governance. Professor Chen interrupted gently. We learned long ago that willing allies are more valuable than conquered subjects. He activated a holographic display showing human territory before and after the conflict. Remarkably, humanity had not claimed a single hegemony world for itself. All occupied territories were being prepared for return to local control. We have everything we need within our own space, Professor Chen continued. Our production capabilities exceed our consumption requirements, our population is stable and prosperous, and our defensive systems ensure that no external threat can successfully attack us. What would we gain by ruling others against their will? This question haunted Zeth Kalar for days. The entire philosophy underlying human civilization seemed to contradict the basic assumptions that drove hegemony expansion. Where the hegemony saw competition for limited resources, humans saw opportunities for cooperative development. Where the hegemony saw the need for control through conquest, humans saw the value of influence through example. The final shock came when human officials announced that prisoner exchanges would begin immediately. Rather than holding captured hegemony personnel as leverage or punishment, they were prepared to release everyone who wished to return home, provided they agreed to abide by the terms of the peace agreement. Zeth Kalar found himself facing a choice he had never expected to have: return to a hegemony that was fundamentally changing under human influence, or remain in human space to continue his education in strategic concepts that challenged everything he had believed about civilization and conflict. He chose to stay. The decision was not easy. His family was on Altarian Prime. His career had been with the hegemony military, and his entire identity was built around concepts of honor and loyalty that seemed to demand his return. But he had seen something in human civilization that he wanted to understand better, a way of thinking about conflict and cooperation that offered possibilities he had never imagined. Many of his fellow prisoners made the same choice. The human educational programs had introduced them to ideas that were impossible to ignore, concepts of governance and strategy that seemed to offer solutions to problems that had plagued galactic civilization for millennia. Those who chose to return home were released with full honors, their time as prisoners acknowledged as unfortunate but understandable given the circumstances of the conflict. Those who chose to remain were offered extended educational opportunities and, eventually, the possibility of citizenship in human space. Zeth Kalar's new life began with an intensive program in what humans called post-conflict reconstruction. He learned about rebuilding societies after warfare, about establishing stable governments that served their populations rather than exploiting them, and about creating economic systems that generated prosperity rather than merely redistributing existing wealth. But most importantly, he learned about the human perspective on what they called the long peace, their ultimate strategic objective of creating a galactic civilization where conflicts were resolved through negotiation and cooperation rather than conquest and subjugation. War, Professor Chen explained during one of their final sessions together, is a failure of imagination. It represents the inability to conceive of solutions that benefit everyone involved. Humanity's greatest strategic innovation was not our military technology. It was our realization that the most decisive victory is achieved when your enemies choose to become your friends. 5 years after the surrender in the labyrinth, Zeth Kalar stands at the observation deck of Harmony Station, humanity's first joint diplomatic facility, watching as ships from dozens of species dock at the massive space station. The vessels represent not conquered territories or occupied worlds, but willing partners in what humans call the Cooperative Council, a replacement for the old Galactic Council that had failed to prevent the human wars. The transformation has been remarkable. Where once the galaxy was dominated by expansionist empires competing for resources and territory, there now exists a loose confederation of species working together to solve common problems. The change wasn't achieved through conquest or coercion, but through demonstration, humanity showing that cooperation produced better results than competition. I still can't believe it sometimes, says Dr. Nextara beside him. The former hegemony captain now serves as a senior advisor on interspecies relations, her military experience having proven invaluable in helping other former warrior cultures adapt to the new galactic paradigm. The speed of change, you mean? Zethkalar asks, though he knows that's not what she means. The speed has been breathtaking, entire civilizations restructuring their governments and economies in less than a decade, but the scope has been even more impressive. The completeness of it. Next, the Hara clarifies. When Admiral Chen said humanity was going to change the galaxy, I thought she meant through conquest and occupation. I never imagined they meant through example and education. Through the transparent aluminium windows they can see the arrival of the latest diplomatic mission, representatives from the Veltaran Republic, one of the few remaining militaristic civilizations in the galaxy. The Veltarans had initially refused all human overtures, declaring their intention to maintain their traditional expansionist policies despite the fate of the hegemony. That defiance had lasted exactly 18 months, until the Veltarans discovered that their traditional conquest targets had all joined the Cooperative Council and were now protected by human defensive agreements. Faced with the choice of adapting to the new galactic order or finding themselves completely isolated, the Veltarans had reluctantly agreed to participate in diplomatic discussions. Zethkalar watches their shit with particular interest. The Veltarans had been the hegemony's primary rivals for centuries, their military capabilities rivaling those of the Altarian fleet. If they could be convinced to abandon their expansionist policies, it would mark the end of large-scale military conflict in the galaxy. They're terrified, observes Commander Sarah Kim, the human liaison officer who has become Zethkalar's closest friend over the past 5 years. Their entire civilization is built around the concept of military superiority, and they've just discovered that they're not even close to being the most powerful force in the galaxy. Sarah speaks from experience. As one of the junior officers aboard Admiral Chen's flagship during the Human Wars, she had witnessed firsthand the psychological impact of humanity's military demonstrations on aggressive species. The realization that their most advanced weapons were obsolete, their most sophisticated tactics were predictable, and their most experienced commanders were outclassed had a profound effect on militaristic civilizations. What's the assessment of their willingness to adapt? Zethkalar asks, though he already knows the answer. His current role involves analyzing the political and social dynamics of species undergoing transition from militaristic to cooperative governance, and he has been studying the Veltarans intensively. Same pattern we've seen with every other species, Sarah replies. Initial denial, followed by anger, then bargaining, then depression, and finally acceptance. The Veltarans are currently somewhere between bargaining and depression. The pattern had indeed proven consistent across dozens of species. The revelation that humanity possessed capabilities that rendered traditional military thinking obsolete created a psychological crisis for civilizations that had built their identities around conquest and expansion. The process of adapting to the new reality was traumatic but ultimately transformative. Zethkalar had lived through that transformation himself. The proud military officer who had served aboard the Final Authority bore little resemblance to the diplomatic analyst he had become. The change hadn't been imposed by human pressure or propaganda. It had emerged naturally from exposure to concepts and possibilities he had never previously considered. Dr. Zethkalar to Conference Room 7, please. The station's communication system announces. The Veltaran delegation has requested your presence at the preliminary discussions. As he makes his way through the station's corridors, Zethkalar reflects on the irony of his current position. 5 years ago, he had been an enemy prisoner, contemplating a future of permanent captivity or execution. Now he was one of the galaxy's leading experts on post-conflict societal transformation, helping former warrior cultures adapt to a reality where warfare had become obsolete. The Cooperative Council had been humanity's masterstroke, a governing body that provided all the benefits of galactic cooperation without the coercive authority that had made previous confederations unstable. Membership was voluntary, decisions were made by consensus, and no species was required to abandon its cultural identity or governmental structure. What made the system work was humanity's role as the ultimate guarantor of security. Any species that chose to attack council members would face the full might of human defensive capabilities, but any species that wished to join the council would receive access to advanced technology, expanded trade opportunities, and protection from external threats. Conference Room 7 is already occupied when Zethkalar arrives. The Veltaran delegation consists of 5 individuals, their insectoid physiology making them appear even more imposing than their reputation suggests. Their leader, General Klixovan, is a veteran of 30 successful conquest campaigns and one of the most decorated military commanders in their species' history. Also present are Professor Chen, representing human diplomatic services, and Dr. Yul Mare of the former hegemony, now serving as a specialist in military to civilian governmental transitions. The composition of the negotiating team itself tells a story, humans working alongside their former enemies to help other former enemies adapt to a post-conflict galaxy. Dr. Zeth Kalar. General Klixovan acknowledges as he enters. The Veltaran's voice carries the mechanical precision typical of his species, but Zeth Kalar can detect the underlying tension. We have been reviewing your analysis of our governmental structure. Your conclusions are disturbing. Zeth Kalar takes his seat at the circular table, designed specifically to avoid any suggestion of hierarchical relationships between participants. I appreciate your frankness, General. Could you specify which aspects of the analysis you find most concerning? General Klixovan activates a holographic display showing the organizational chart of Veltaran government. It's a classic military hierarchy, with clear chains of command extending from the Supreme War Council down to individual planetary administrators. Every position of authority is held by a military officer, and every governmental decision is made according to strategic military priorities. You suggest that this structure is fundamentally incompatible with membership in the Cooperative Council, the General says. You recommend a complete reorganization of our civilization around civilian priorities. This is equivalent to asking us to abandon everything that makes us Veltaran. With respect, General. Zeth Kalar replies carefully. I don't believe that's an accurate characterization of my recommendations. The analysis suggests that certain aspects of Veltaran culture, your emphasis on honor, your commitment to excellence, your tradition of disciplined service, are not only compatible with Council membership, but could be valuable contributions to galactic civilization. He gestures to the display, highlighting specific elements of the Veltaran governmental structure. The challenge is not your cultural values, but the assumption that those values can only be expressed through military conquest. My analysis suggests alternative applications for Veltaran capabilities that would be more consistent with Council membership. Professor Chen leans forward, his expression earnest. General, we've seen this transition successfully completed by dozens of species. The Altarian hegemony, the Krexval Empire, the Nextul Confederation, all of them were militaristic civilizations that found ways to preserve their cultural identity while abandoning expansionist policies. And all of them, General Klixovan replies with bitter emphasis, are shadows of their former selves. Their military traditions have been abandoned, their warrior cultures have been replaced by civilian bureaucracies, and their young people no longer aspire to the greatness that military service provides. Dr. Yulmer, who had served in the hegemony military before joining the transition program, speaks for the first time. General, I understand your concerns because I shared them. I believed that abandoning our conquest policies would mean abandoning everything that made life meaningful. I was wrong. She activates her own display showing comparative data on quality of life, economic productivity, and social satisfaction across former militaristic civilizations before and after their transitions. Every former warrior culture that has joined the Council has seen improvements in every measurable aspect of citizen welfare. She continues. Crime rates have decreased, educational achievement has increased, technological innovation has accelerated, and social cohesion has strengthened. Our people are not shadows of their former selves. They are better versions of their former selves. General Klixovan studies the data with the analytical precision that had made him a successful military commander. These improvements could be temporary. They could be the result of human technological assistance rather than genuine cultural advancement. And they could be purchased at the cost of everything that gives life meaning and purpose. Zeth Kalar recognizes the argument. He had made similar points during his own transition period. General, may I ask what you believe gives life meaning and purpose? Excellence. The Veltaran replies immediately. The pursuit of perfection in service to something greater than oneself. The opportunity to test one's capabilities against worthy opponents. The satisfaction of overcoming challenges that seem impossible to overcome. And you believe these opportunities only exist in military conquest? General Klixovan hesitates, perhaps recognizing the trap in the question. They exist most clearly in military conquest. Civilian pursuits lack the stakes, the intensity, the potential for genuine heroism. General, Professor Chen interjects gently, you're speaking to three individuals who found their greatest challenges, their most meaningful purposes, and their most satisfying achievements in the process of transforming warrior cultures into cooperative civilizations. Is it possible that your definition of worthy challenges might be too narrow? The question hangs in the air as General Klixovan